We begin at 5:20. At 5:20 we'll begin.
Unusual talk with an author, discussion with an author at the Ashok Club. Today we have Mr. Amit Ranjan. Welcome, Amit. And there will be his book launch on John Lang, Wanderer of Hindustan, Slender in Hindustani, and Lawyer for the Rani. What a long title. Interesting. Amit will be in conversation with a well-known personality of Jaipur, Tusharika Singh. Welcome, Tusharika. Well, for the benefit of our visiting author and some who are not regulars, though I see most of you are regulars who come and attend our talks, and the cost of repeating myself to our regular audience, let me mention that our efforts to present interesting personalities at the Ashok Club has been going on from the pre-COVID era, so to say. We had requested Her Highness the Rajmata Sahiba to kindly, she's also the ex-officio president of this club, so we had requested her to grant us permission to use this hall to host these talks. And our request to do was most graciously granted by Rajmata Sahiba, and since then Jags and I have been in business, so to say, and brought many interesting speakers to all of you. So we need to thank the royal family for granting this permission to us. Once again, I commence the proceedings by calling upon Jags to kindly present a plant to Amit Ranjan, the author. Welcome once again. Please put it on your writing desk for added inspiration. And may I request Mr. Vinod Khatri of Centrum Ved to kindly come forward and present a similar plant to Ms. Tusharika Singh. Tusharika is also a writer, thinker, blogger.
Sir,
So,
look.
welcome to Tusharika. Now may I request copies of the book we would like to release before we proceed with the author's introduction. Jax, can you do that?
Yeah. Come up or
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, it's better. Okay, very quickly. Photo ops. So you are the only one who sent it to me. Thank you. Now with the formalities over, I would like to start by introducing our guest of honor. Mr. Amit Ranjan had his college education at St. Stephen's College, Delhi. And I'm proud to say that we are about half a dozen of us from St. Stephen's here to welcome you. And you must have a photograph some of the Stephenians later on. He went later on to become a Fulbright scholar, which took him for further studies at Florida International University. He completed his doctoral studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University and is also a recipient of the prestigious INLAC scholarship, very short after when I was also in college that time. And he became a visiting scholar at the University of New South Wales, Australia. From his CV, I note that he not only studied but also taught at several prestigious universities before taking up his present assignment at NCERT in Delhi, where he heads the translation department and is also assistant professor of English literature. Mr. Ranjan has also authored two other books, namely The Knot of Juggernaut in 2019, and before that in 2018 he wrote a book of poems, Find Me, Leonard Cohen, I'm Almost 30. As I mentioned, Mr. Ranjan completed his doctoral studies from JNU, and the subject of his doctoral thesis was the interesting character and personality from the mid-19th century India called Mr. John Lang. We can all imagine that this maverick Australian who arrived in the pre-mutiny days in India and achieved considerable fame must have indeed led a very interesting life. This perhaps encouraged Mr. Ranjan to author this interesting book on John Lang, Wanderer of Hindustan, Slanderer in Hindustani, and Lawyer for the Rani. This book brings out many noteworthy aspects of the then prevailing socio-cultural norms and conditions, and the protagonist records some of his observations and on the contemporary issues throws some light for the reader. I don't want to go into more details because Tusharika will delve deeper into that subject as our discussions proceed. It is indeed a very interesting character, John Lang. I understand that Mr. Ranjan's next book will be a biography on the 17th century Mughal prince Dara Shikoh. He is also working on a book depicting the journey of indentured Indians to Guyana and their further migration to USA and Canada. We are looking forward to these two in the future as well. This evening, Amit will be in conversation as announced with Tusharika Singh. Tusharika, as all of you know, is a well-known personality of Jaipur, alumna of Lady Sri Ram College, where she completed her Masters in Modern Indian History. She also holds a postgraduate degree in Journalism and Mass Communication. Tusharika is associated with the leading PR firm of Jaipur, Spark PR, for the past 9 years. In fact, her city-centric articles published in various newspapers greet us in the morning ever so often. She runs a popular city blog all about Jaipur, which highlights the various cultural and social happenings, places and events in and around the city. She is keenly associated with the activities of prestigious brands and institutions like the Rambagh Palace, Jawahar Kala Kendra, Jaipur Literature Festival, to name a few. With that, I conclude my introductions and may I request Tusharika to start the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Singha, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us today. So, welcome back to Jaipur, Amit.
Thank you so much.
And before we begin the session, I would love to share with the audience how I first met Amit and how he's here today with us to discuss his book on John Lang. So, I remember back in 2019, Amit was in Jaipur at a poetry session in Jawahar Kala Kendra, and he was discussing his debut collection of poems that I have here. It has a very interesting title, Find Me Leonard Cohen, I'm Almost 30. And during the latter part of the session, he recited some of his poems, and there was this one particular poem that really amused me. And after I listened to that poem, I ordered that book sitting right there. And once it arrived, I wrote an email to him talking about his poems, and that's how we connected, and I got to know about his other works. So, to give you the background, I would like to read a few lines from that poem that particularly piqued my interest in his poetry. Since Mr. Singha just mentioned that I studied history in LSR, I'm just repeating that to give you some context for this poetry. So this poem is called bharatmatrimony.com. Now matrimony here is not spelled as M-O-N-Y but M-O-N-E-Y. Basically it's a satire on how the matrimonial alliances take place in our society. So it goes like, welcome to bharatmatrimony.com, and of pictures we'll burn a CD-ROM. We'll burn the family pictures and sanctify them by holy scriptures. And the 7 merry-go-rounds you can pay in rupees, dollars or pounds. LSR girls are not allowed. So this particular line really amused me, and I couldn't help giggle right there in the session, and Amit noticed that as well, and that was the beginning of our friendship. And I'm very glad that today you are here and we are in conversation about your book.
Very much.
So Amit, from poetry, you've written 2 poetry books, to this very, very well-researched academic, literary, historical work on a character called John Lang. I don't think most of us knew about John Lang before coming to this session. How many of us here knew of John Lang or have heard of John Lang? 4. Okay. So, if you Google John Lang, when I started reading this book, I thought, let me Google John Lang. What you get to know is that he's most well known for being the lawyer of Rani of Jhansi. And he was Australia's first native-born writer. But when I read Amit's work, I realized that there is so much more to Lang, and he's such an interesting character, and I don't know why there has been no work done before Amit's work came out. So in 1964, Ruskin Bond stumbled upon Lang's grave in Missouri, in Camel's Back Road, where he's buried. And he did some research on Lang, but again, there was silence for 4 decades. And when Ruskin Bond did his research in 1964, that was 100 years after Lang had passed away. And after Ruskin Bond's, he talked about Lang in some of his articles, and after that, again, there was a complete silence for 4 decades. Then in 2002, the then spokesperson of the Australian High Commission, along with an Australian scholar, did some research work, and in 2005, a plaque of John Lang was unveiled at a church in Missouri. So this was also the time in 2006 when Amit started researching on John Lang, and while these were the early seeds of revival, but it was Amit's work that really brought John Lang into the highlight. And so much so that in 2014, when Narendra Modi, our Prime Minister, was visiting the Australian Parliament, he presented a commemorative photo collage of John Lang to Tony Abbott. And his work, it was because of Amit's work that John Lang came into light, though this was not acknowledged then. So, Amit, you have been working on John Lang since 2006-2005. What led you to choose John Lang as your subject of research? When you actually began your research, you were researching on a person called Alice Richmond. So what piqued your interest in John Lang? And in fact, you start your book with a chapter called Who Was John Lang? So we would love to know from you, who was John Lang?
First of all, thanks God for having me over. And as Shalika described, friendship through a line in my poetry book. So this is how serendipities and accidents happen in life. And thanks a lot to Ashok Club as well for having me over, and to all the members of the August audience. Very privileged to be here. Najib said a lot of things, but to answer exactly what piqued my interest in John Lang, like that line in poetry book, it was sheer accident. I was after something else, like you already mentioned, a girl called Alice, Alice Richmond, whose grave is in Pune University grounds. Because it's inside a university and it's a lone grave, there's a lot of interest amongst the students always. There's lots of urban legend. For example, that a ghost haunts the campus in white robes in the diya at night, or that she was in love with a Hindu boy, unrequited love, both committed suicide, etc. etc. PR of the university said that the graves don't say she died of cholera. The PR of the university, I remember distinctly in an article in Indian Express, said that it's neither love nor cholera, both of which are possible, but that she died of falling off a horseback. It is too wide. And I got to the bottom of that matter as well later on. So I'll tell you very briefly. So initially there was nothing that could be found about Alice. She was not a civil servant, not a military officer. But eventually I did find out she was the niece of Sir James Ferguson, after whom Ferguson College in Pune is named. And once I started finding things out, I could find out more. And there's this one particular page in Sydney Bulletin which has mentioned 3 deaths off horseback. So 2 wrestlers fighting, and the wrestler punches the referee instead of the other wrestler. The referee gallops away on a horse, falls and dies. A daughter having an argument with the father, gallops away on a horse, dies. And then there's the report of Alice and her aunt Olive falling to cholera in Bombay and Pune subsequently. And somehow these news articles get mixed up. And 120 years later, Gangadhar Changamwal of Pune University says that she fell off a horseback. So this is how history and memory operate in very strange ways. So that was Alice, and by the side, I had to do a Hanuman because I couldn't find anything about it. So I lifted the entire Pahad, lifted the whole mountain about what Australians were doing in India, and started doing all kinds of research about Australians, and chanced upon John Lang, a prolific lawyer who fought cases only of Indians against the British, a writer who wrote about women and against British, and an editor of a newspaper called Office Light, which ran from Agra and Meerut, and he wrote against the British. So it was fascinating, a white man fighting against the white establishment. A gold mine that had to be discovered.
Great. So, like I said, Lang was most well known as the lawyer of Rani of Jhansi. But what's interesting is that apart from the circumstances of the case, that why he was summoned by the Rani, her kingdom was going to be annexed due to the doctrine of lapse. What is very interesting is that John Lang is probably the only one who has documented the persona of Rani of Jhansi. And he's written about it in the book. And that document is often quoted when people are talking about Rani of Jhansi. And though he lost Rani's case, but the Rani of Jhansi was very impressed with his wit, and she went on to gift him very fancy gifts like a pair of greyhounds, camels, elephants, and even a portrait of herself. And I would love to know from you, I would like you to read that passage where he describes the Rani of Jhansi. And later there was also a lot of conjecture in Indian TV about the relationship of Rani of Jhansi and the lawyer. So how much of it was true? What was their relationship like? It's on page 221.
Right, so interestingly, as things stand in history, often it's the lost causes which are remembered. And because this is the connection with Rani of Jhansi, this is probably the least Lang did in his career. The case lasted only 1 week. The East India Company was determined to humiliate John Lang because just prior to that, he had won a case of Lala Jyoti Prasad, who had provided provisions to the East India Company in the Anglo-Sikh War. So I just saw a portrait from Anglo-Sikh War right here, in which Lala Jyoti Prasad had supplied provisions. And he won the case for him. So after that, he became very famous in the upper provinces, what is now Uttar Pradesh. And so the Rani was impressed and summoned him. And arguably, this is the only account written of the Rani in English by a white writer, and which is often quoted by historians who write about 1857 and Rani. Lang has taken his literary liberties over here. But it's a very interesting account. And also something to mark is he's used the exact same words, and you could call it premonition. That happens a lot in Lang's writing. There are at least 4 or 5 incidents which actually happened later in life. It could also be his shararat, because he was a shararati character. But it's almost the same words that he uses for Jenny Day in his novel, which came out prior to his meeting with Rani. Or he deliberately wrote the date wrong in the novel to make it sound like a premonition. But I'll read out this excerpt about his description of the Rani. I had heard from the Vakil that the Rani was a very handsome woman of about 6 or 7 and 20 years of age, and I was very curious indeed to get a glimpse of her, and whether it was by accident or by design on the Rani's part, I know not, my curiosity was gratified. The curtain was drawn aside by the little boy, and I had a good view of the lady. It was only for a moment, it is true, Still, I saw her sufficiently to be able to describe her. She was a woman of about middle size, rather stout, but not too stout. Her face must have been very handsome when she was younger, and even now it had many charms, though according to my idea of beauty, it was too round. The expression was also very good and intelligent, the eyes were particularly fine, and the nose very delicately shaped, etc. etc. So this is 19th century way of writing where every physical feature of characters is generally described. And also Mark Harvey says that she must have been beautiful in her younger days. So 26 is very old in 1853 because the average age was probably 30. Most people died of quarter plague, so he says the standards of beauty are defined at 16 or 18 at this point of time. And this has often been quoted by historians right about 1857, and they are mistaken for a British man. He was Australian, of course. Australia was not independent at that point of time, but they all quote him as a British lawyer. Partly because he himself posed as a British gentleman, because it was his angst, because of the caste system inherent in Australia, where people of convict origin. So Australia was a convict colony. People were transported to Australia for stealing spoons and then made to work as laborers over there. And subsequently they got free generationally. So there was a clear distinction between the free people and those of convict origin. Lang happened to be of convict origin. So he had this great angst against the gentry of Britain, and he found very good allies in India to fight the British, which is why this white man fighting the white man. So Rani was very impressed and gave him lots of gifts. In modern imaginations, ZTV had used a serial on Jhansi of Rani where they showed John Lang playing cricket with the Rani. She's batting and he's bowling, and there's some sort of flirtation happening between them, which is all false. This is the only paragraph that exists about his relationship with the Rani, and this is also exaggerated. He's taken his poetic liberties to say that she lifted the veil for him, etc. etc. We do not exactly know about it.
So you mentioned that Rani was very impressed with the way Lang had fought Lala Jyoti Parsad's case. And you have a chapter in your book called The Curious Case of the Lala, or The Furious Face of the Lala, which is also the longest chapter of your book. And so, as you said, that Lang was a little notorious, and he passed off Lala Jyoti Parsad's portrait, because he had also gifted him a portrait after he won his case, and he passed off his portrait to a newspaper called the London, which was it? The London Illustrated News. And he passed off his portrait as that of Nana Sahib, and that was carried on for like many years. And there's another instance where you mentioned that there was a poem by Edgar Allan Poe called The Raven, and Lang said in his review of the poem that it's very good Persian, because he said that it's a complete copy of a Persian poem. So he was known to make such comments and to engage in such notorious acts. So what do you have to say about that?
Sure. This will be slightly long if you don't mind. So the famous case because of which Rani called summoned Lang is the Lala Jyoti Prasad case. Lala Jyoti Prasad was a commissariat contractor who supplied provisions to the British in the two anniversary wars, 1840 to 1844, 1845 to 49, roughly those years. And the British, instead of paying him up, charged him with forgery and slapped a fine on him, jailed him, and Lala Jyoti Prasad summoned John Lang to fight the case. Lang's ego was hurt because he was the guarantor for the case, and the cops, the police had taken away his overcoat and his umbrella. So that's what hurt him most, and he was determined to win the case. So for a week, Lang did nothing. He just listened to the prosecution. The case was fought in a military court in Meerut, and Lala Jyoti Prasad thought that the whole matter was in vain because Lang was a famous alcoholic. It was his own self-projected image. It's largely a self-projected image because you cannot be a prolific writer if you are an alcoholic, but he liked that image of himself to be projected. So Lala Jyoti Prasad thought that this is a gone case, he's on alcohol, he's not going to fight. The 8th day, Lang spoke, And when he spoke, he had been taking notes for 7 days, and he tore the prosecution to shreds within a day. So a day before the judgment was to be pronounced, there was a party. And some 30 years after Lang passed away, a military soldier, ex-military soldier wrote an account of that night, where he says that John Lang was no teetotaler and John Exshaw was the leading spirit of the time. So John Lang inebriated on John Exshaw was asked, what do you think of the jury? John Lang said, they are a bunch of damned sewers, pigs. So his friend said, oh, you're drunk, you're saying all this, can you say this in the court? And there was a wager of 1,000 rupees. So of course I can say it in the court. So the next day in the court, he said that he came aboard a ship called Nile from England to fight this particular case. And this part of the case where the Lala has been accused of forgery on this count smells like the rotten leg of the pig they were served on the pig and so on and so forth. So all the charges that were leveled, he equated them with different parts of a pig's anatomy and called everybody a pig of the jury. So much so that the judge advocate general in the end said that he was ashamed to be associated with the case at all. So he won the case and the bet of the 1,000 rupees. So the case was for 30 lakh rupees. So Lang got 110, 3 lakh fee. And he got a portrait of Lala Jyoti Prasad, which he always carried. So he spent 5 years in England trying to rival Charles Dickens as a writer between 1853 and 58, because it was important to be in London to register your books, otherwise they could be stolen. So during this time the mutiny happened, and it's very interesting also that the newspaper was being produced from within the Agra fort, protected by the British soldiers, and the newspaper was decidedly anti-British. So that kind of intellectual and journalistic freedom existed at that time. Something to marvel about. Of course, the Press Act, etc., came later, and John Lang may have had a hand in it with his behavior towards the government. So anyway, Nana Sahib became notorious at this point of time because of the killing of women and children at Kanpur, an overnight villain in the British imagination. Lang had met Nana Sahib, so this journalist visiting him in London thought that he must have a portrait of Nana Sahib, and there was the portrait of Lala Jyoti Prasad hanging over there. And the journalist thought this must be Nana Sahib. So Lang is alleged to have said that this man resembles Nana Sahib only as much as you resemble the Queen. So leave it alone. But the journalist took it and printed and made an illustration and printed it. And that picture of Lala Jyoti Prasad has passed down our history books till date. So this is how primary sources of history can also be so erroneous. So Nana Sahib's supporters were distraught that he has a pot belly, he looks like a Lala, so all the stereotype. And Lala's supporters were very happy that, oh, our Lala looks like royalty with a sword, scabbard and all that. And Lala himself had to go into hiding because he was wanted dead or alive in that picture. And this is why Lang did not want this secret to be revealed. It got revealed only after both of them died.
Very interesting. So, talking about Lang as a writer, as you mentioned that he was running a newspaper for 20 years single-handedly, which was also anti-British. And in his lifespan of 48 years, he wrote some 20 novels. He's written 33 articles for Charles Dickens' journal Household Words. And you say that while Dickens became a household name that time, but Lang was barely known. When you talk about his writing, you say that he had a very anti-racist, anti-caste, anti-class stance. And another very fascinating thing is that most of the protagonists in his works were women. But there's also a juxtaposition there because whenever he talks about, his writings mainly borrow from his experiences in India, and he talks about Anglo-Indian children and their challenges, but whenever he's talking about these Anglo-Indian children, they're always from a wedlock of a native Indian woman and an English man, and never the other way around. So what do you have to say about Lang as a writer?
That's too many questions rolled into one. Let me try to figure out. First, his stance about women. Lang himself was married twice. He divorced his first wife, and divorce was an impossibility in Victorian England. So he got a special divorce and married an Anglo-Indian lady just before he died, a couple of years. And married because they already had his children out of, without marrying. So he was so much ahead of his time, so to say. But he understands women very well, and most of his novels have women protagonists, which is very unlike the Victorian age, which is very, very conservative. And his women are also divorced, single, living with a man, and so on and so forth. So it's very ahead of its time. He's almost 100 years ahead of his time in his outlook towards women, etc. So that's why he's very fascinating. And which is why he was completely jumped by British critics. So he would probably have been as big a writer as Charles Dickens, the absolute contemporaries and friends. And all the Indian material in Charles Dickens' journal is John Lang's. But Lang is not famous because the British critics completely jumped him and called him a hospital bed novelist and things like that. So he's very progressive. The word feminism didn't exist then, and he still is one. For example, in a story called Black and Blue, there is this young ensign called Francis Gale, who is from royalty in England. He comes as a soldier to India. He's completely debauched, drunk. So in a way, that's also his self-portrait. And then he's admonished that he should mend his ways so that he becomes better in life, so he's capable of handling affairs of the state, etc. So what he does is he falls in love with a girl, and Lang flaunts his knowledge of India by saying that this is the girl from the Bhishli caste, she's of black color, and do not think in your racist terms of white and black. India has all shades. There are people fairer than Europeans and darker than people from Congo. But this girl is black, and she's Bhishli, and she's Muslim. So he marginalizes, uses all the marginalized categories, and makes this guy from a royal family marry her. And of course, the whole of the infantry is outraged, the priest is outraged, and Francis gives a long lecture to the priest about God and that you are a false prophet, or a false priest, the entire church is false, and so on and so forth. So he uses these characters as mouthpieces. And he also, about his protagonist, always says India he loved, England he despised. So there's a clear progressive element in him, pro-India and pro-women. But there's a writer to that, like you said, the Anglo-Indian children that he mentions, which also Kipling does later on in Kim. Kim is one of foundational works of Rudyard Kipling. But Kim is almost lifted from the story Black and Blue, the first part of it. Very similar phraseology of the guy, boy having blue eyes and black skin and so on and so forth. But he talks about children out of the wedlock of British men and Indian women. So he could not break that mold, he could not do the reverse, probably also because it was not possible. It was so closely guarded. Like later on, when it started happening in the 20th century, like Melbourne girls on their way to England ran off with Indian princes. There are at least 3 or 4 instances. There was a huge outrage in the British Empire, and these families were completely boycotted, disinherited by law and so on.
Since we are talking about writing and how Lang was a writer, I'd love to know something about your writing process. Since you've written 2 poetry books apart from this academic work, and also working on another academic work, how difficult or easy it is for you to work on such kind of books and as compared to poetry, and what are the challenges of getting such kind of works published? Since you started researching in 2005, but your book eventually came out in 2021. So what are the processes and challenges?
Sure. Well, there's different kinds of writers. I'm one kind. I started writing very early when I was 11. Started writing poetry, started reciting my own poems in school. So poetry sort of comes to me naturally. Of course, poetry is a process and not a verdict. Verdict has to be given by people. But if one learns poetry, The rest of it is easy. That's the foundation. That's the most difficult because that's the most ancient. It's 1,000, 2,000 years old. Since we know language, we know poetry. So to understand poetry is difficult. And once you get a hang of it, the rest of it becomes easy. So which is why this book is also written very differently, not like a regular dry history book. Chronologically, there's no chronology to the book. It's associative like a postmodern novel. It jumps from one incident to another, whichever relates to whatever one incident leading to the other. So I've also experimented with history writing. So it's not historical fiction, neither is it creative non-fiction. One could call it creative non-fiction. There are zero liberties taken with facts. It's supported by 100 pages merely of notes. But history can be written like literature, can be written like a novel. You can use poetry also in between. It's something I've experimented with. Thankfully, unfortunately, successfully, because people have really liked this, and so history can be written differently is what I was trying to do. Of course, it takes a lot of research, and took 4 or 5 years of research, and a year in Australia, and I had this much material. I also lost a pen drive which had all the newspapers of John Lang. So I sat down with my supervisor all night on my birthday. Before writing the PhD, there were only 4 months left. And he could not tell me, was something from value, by the way. He could not tell me anything all night. And eventually he said, look, I'll tell you only one thing. That Pablo Picasso knew how to draw portraits very well, realistic portrait. He knew realism very well. But he did, what he had. Cubism. That's what you have to do. You know how to write history very well, but do something with it. So I said, all right, then this PhD will be in 50 chapters of 10 pages each instead of the regular 5 chapters and introduction and conclusion. So it begins with a letter to Lang and it jumps from here to there, wherever the associations are forged. So that's how the writing process is. But about the process itself, I'm very erratic. I like to slog. Whenever I hear the whisper, that's when I write. There will be this as well.
What about the challenges of publishing such kind of works?
It was a huge challenge because the publishers who said the writing is great, we are fascinated, why don't you write a book about Aurangzeb or this or that? So that's how the Darashika book is happening. I pitched John Lang and they said, why don't you do a book on Mughals? I said, why don't I do a book on somebody who could not become a Mughal and was murdered? That's how the Darashika book is happening. But so people found it fascinating. They said nobody knows John Lang, so they were interested. And despite the Prime Minister incident that happened, the publishers were very interested, but they did not know what kind of an audience could get. So eventually, Yogi Books, they were very fascinated, and they did it, but it took a long time. So yes, publishing a non-fiction book for the first time is difficult. Then, of course, once you know it becomes easy. But yes, it's also because with today's social media and everything, there's so much noise that it's a little difficult to sit for the publishers also. So you get aging these days and all of that. So it's slightly difficult to break into the scene.
Another very interesting thing that I noticed in your book was that you mentioned that John Lang was very keen on getting his post-mortem done after he died. And when his post-mortem was done, it was found out that his brain actually weighed 8 ounces lesser than the brain of a human adult. But it had an excess of grey substance, and that's what his intelligence and thought is attributed to. So what are your comments on that?
This is a very interesting area called phrenology. So like palmistry, phrenology was a very big thing in the 19th century. It was compared with telegraph in the 1850s, that's as revolutionary as telegraph. So the premise is that like your hand, the lines on your palm tell you on what's inside. Similarly, the brain must be mapped on the skull inside and therefore the skull outside. And if you can study the skull, it's easier. The only problem is that a live skull cannot be studied because there's skins, the person has to be dead. So you could study the skull. And this was a major racket in the 19th century. You can't imagine how major it was. So, for example, this convict in Tasmania, who was a small champachor, like I said, spoon thief from England who was transported to Australia. And so he was executed. So the fascinating categories would of course be geniuses and criminals. These are the two most fascinating categories to study. So he was hanged over stealing some spoons or something like that. And then stories were made up about his cannibalism, that he had escaped from the jail, eaten a man and came back with a hand of his. This is all completely concocted, I think. All stories of cannibalism are. The only cannibals were the Europeans themselves. When they got caught on the sea and could not get food, they ate each other. But all this fancy thing that Africans ate each other, convicts ate each other, none of that existed. So these kind of stories were built, and these skulls were transported from Australia to India to London to Philadelphia, which was the epicenter, the headquarters of this phrenology business. So it would start with $10 with the Spaniard, and by the time it ended with Philip Morton in Philadelphia, the cost would be $5,000, with all kinds of stories about cannibalism and this and that added. So Lang was very aware of this pseudoscience, and he wrote about it in his novels, made fun of it. And this is a joke upon himself. He probably wanted that his skull is smaller, because systematically, and this is what Darwinism also is founded on. So we think of Darwin as a scientist, but as a social scientist, Darwin is actually regressive. He himself owned slaves, and what he did systematically proved that we have evolved from Africans, that the African skull is inferior to the European skull, and women's skull are smaller than men's skull, and so on. So all this gained scientific, all these prejudices, social prejudices, gained a scientific basis with Darwin. Lang makes fun of it, also represents what things are happening in the sea, and probably it's a joke upon himself. He wanted that his skull is smaller than the average.
So you said you're working next on a book on Darashiko, and there's also a poetry book in the pipeline. And you end your book with a beautiful poem that you've written for Lang and Alice. So I would request you if you could read that out for our audience.
Sure. So this is a poem about Lang and Alice Richmond. The context you have now. You have to page number 8. It's absolutely available. If die I will, which I will not. It is my will that I be given a grave, so that 150 years later, some wanderer spots an old wanderer not at his best, ignominiously at rest. Like I spotted Alice, the stupid epitaphist behaves like a tigress and doesn't mention if her cheeks were like rose, but says she was born at Melrose. Died in 1882 at this very spot, died of cholera. They never write that on soldiers' graves. A poet says she died 4 years before the epitaphist wrote his choleric prose about dates and Melrose. Poor Alice, rich man. Graves to lie, or how else would Keats's name be writ on water? Or is it why they say stone wash? Alice's ghost refused to tell any more, but hangs around and takes me to Landor's ghosts, hills, thunder, rain, dark nights, perfect to raise a toast to the ghost of a Moffasilite. The young barrister ran away from Sydney as if drunk upon verses of Sir Philip Sidney and his huge desire. The gale of the sea done, he had to face the ire of the Raj Babus and see jail and dungeon, for he shook them a little with his words and letters. Cicero he wanted to be, and barely knew any fetters. The Rani of Jhansi gifted him with a portrait, for he unsuccessfully defended her sealed fate. Once he saved the child from the seas wild, but the seas of time have quite drowned the man, and the name is indeed writ on water. He could not become Dickens, but his poetry about Jenny Day and her name all round in the gale tells a very old tale of love. He lies in Camel's Back Cemetery. Camels store water on their back. Alice and John did not know each other, but their graves do. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we can open the house for questions.
Is the mic available? Anyone wants?
Amit, firstly, thank you for a lovely session. It's been most enlightening, hearing it, because fortunately I, read Lang's own work, and his character has always fascinated me. And I'm sure your book will have a lot more to say than what John Lang has said himself. The other is, which I told you personally, but for the benefit of the audience, when your second edition of this book comes out in the next week or so, I'll introduce you to the descendants of the people whom John Lang mentions in his biography.
That'll be wonderful.
The other one is about your book on Dara Shikoh. A friend of mine published a book about a decade ago, Murad Ali Beg. The title of the book is Ocean of Cobras. Now, in that book, and it's a historical fact, that in that decisive battle of Samur, also called Fatehabad, close to south of Agra, the person who led Aurangzeb's army behind the imperial forces of Shah Jahan and Akbar, his descendant lives in Delhi. He's also a Slavenian, a Doon school, and I think a Slavenian, but he did his PhD in South Asian history under Professor Walter. What's his name?
I think we should keep to the...
Okay, whatever it is. But coming to that, I'll introduce you to them. But this has been a fascinating thing, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. Thank you for the ground.
Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to all this new knowledge added to this class. Thank you.
Maybe with your contemporary or the author, you should ask your classmate.
Hi, Amit. I wanted to know, completely off the discussion. Did you interact with Baker Saab at college, and was he influential in any other way? Because the amount of kind of stories that he used to tell us, walking through the ridge, were you part of that circuit? Was he influential?
Unfortunately not. Baker was such a terror that I kept my distance mostly. I did interact with him later when I taught at St. Stephen's twice in 2012 and 17. So I interacted with him much later, but he was a little off focus by then. But during college I did not much. But glad to have you here at the Village. We are classmates, batchmates from college.
Yeah, hi. Just wanted to know why Lang favored the Indians against the Britishers so much. Any particular fondness for a particular person or any incident which sort of put him off the Britishers?
So, like you said, so just for kidding's sake, he loved Indian women and he had affairs, which is not clearly documented. The fictional accounts of all that. So that could be one reason. But the clear reason that we know about is what I earlier said, that there was a definite caste system in Australia, not known as caste, but clearly all the convicts were transported and their descendants were treated as second-class citizens. And he himself was of convict origin. His grandfather was from the first week in 1788. And because of this difference between free people and people of convict origin, he had this great angst against the British gentry, the British royalty. And so he calls himself ESQ as squire all the time in his books. And so he hated the British gentry and royalty with passion. And in Indians he found a suitable ally. And as a lawyer he took therefore cases only of Indians against the British and constantly humiliated the British in all ways, as in his newspaper, in his novels, as a lawyer. That was his thing.
I would like to congratulate Tusharika for such an enticing session and thank you for all the insightful knowledge which you've given us. My question to you is, as an author, how difficult or different it is to write poetry and then to write academic books, history? How difficult is it to switch when you have to write? How does it go?
I think poetry is most difficult. The rest you can train yourself for. For prose, you can always train through writing schools, through universities. It's of course a lot of hard work. If it has to be literary and historically authentic, it's a lot of hard work, especially history, because, like I gave you examples from Alice and from Lamb, even primary sources can be erroneous, and especially in these times of internet, people believe in anything that's not viral. History is a matter of great patience, where you have to cross-check from 10 different sources and still present it as partly fictional because of so much that has happened and so much chatter that has happened during that time. Fortunately, during 19th century, there's a lot of writing by housewives, by military men, by all kinds of people. So it's very rich in terms of comparing sources and then presenting a picture. So one has to be very rigorous with history writing, of course. And poetry is a different ball game, of course. You need a certain kind of inspiration and sensibility. That's also in trouble with social media at the moment. But yeah, there are two very different forms. Like I said, one trains oneself in poetry, everything else becomes solid, if you want.
Thank you. One more question I have. Do we see a movie coming from John Lang?
We do. So I've been in conversation with people for 10 years, and somehow it's not happened. The Australian filmmakers, Indian filmmakers, but because the canvas is so big with all these Anglo-Indian wars and so many characters, there are about 100 characters in the book, that it needs a really big filmmaker or somebody with a vivid imagination to pull it off. So unfortunately, it hasn't worked out till now, but in the next couple of years, coming couple of years.
And I would like to know, one, how much of John Lang is in you? How much of a John Lang are you? And the second thing is, how is this person viewed in his own country, that is Australia?
Thank you very much for that question. So they say that the first work of any writer, the first prose work of any writer, generally fiction, is autobiographical. Now this is non-fiction, but still written like fiction. So yes, you're right, I see a lot of John Lang in myself. He's a larrikin character, as the Australians say, loosely translated to shaitan, badmash and such things. Somebody who's naughty, somebody who likes pranks, and somebody who is, and Lang was also a wanderer. He liked to travel a lot. He's very witty. He's also very literary. He's got Shakespeare and Byron and others for his inspiration. So I see those shades. I resonated with all of that, with the wandering and with trying to relate life to literature and all that, which is why I was so attracted to. And one molds one's subject also that way. So of course, ideologically molded him also in my fashion. Somebody else would have written very differently about Lang. That's the first part. What was the second part?
How was it viewed in Australia?
How was it viewed in Australia? Thankfully for me, the Australians did not have much interest in him beyond his time in Australia. So Rolf Bollywood and George Earnshaw have written about him. George Earnshaw has written about him in the 1960s. That concerns largely with his family lineage and his connections and all of that. So that helped me really get a sense of where he's coming from, his context. But beyond that, I did not have an interest in his Indian career. But like his protagonists say, India, he loved, England, he despised. So his entire career was in India. So that was left wide open for me. And so it was very challenging and interesting for me to work on that. That had not been worked on at all.
We have Amit's books available at the back. at a discounted price, and he's available here to sign them. So if anybody would like to do that, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I have one question. So what is the importance of the primary sources and secondary sources? For instance, we know that the best known biography of the Beatles is written by Philip Norman. It's called Shout, the True Story of the Beatles. He came for the Jaipur Lit Fest also. For 10 years he tried to meet any of the Beatles. The Beatles refused to meet him. But he went to Liverpool and he, interviewed each and every person who could have had a role in Beatles' life in Liverpool and elsewhere in the rest of the world. And he managed to interview the manager also, Brian Epstein. And so finally he comes out with the biography, which is one. Finally, John Lennon agreed to meet him, but unfortunately, just 1 week before his meeting, he was assassinated. So that was a tragic thing, but his book is now considered as the ultimate one, thousands of books written on Beatles. So can you tell us what is the difference between a primary and a secondary source? Because he never met the primary source.
And there's a lot of resonance with my book on John Lang. Because I never met John Lang, which of course I can't, but I never met him via his writing about himself as well. Because generally people wrote a lot of journals, diaries during this time. All of John Lang's property is completely lost because the family shifted from Mussoorie to present-day Bangladesh and from there to somewhere else during the Second World War. So what I had to piece together his life and what everybody else had to say, all his, what Charles Dickens had to say, what Henry George Keen, other writers at the time, other people who knew him at the time. So you get a bird's eye view, you get a profile picture, rather than if I had more of Lang's documents, I'd probably have been consumed by his own self-image, which is probably what you don't want. Which is why autobiographies are generally weak. It's biographies which are stronger because it incorporates different kinds of viewpoints, because autobiographies would tweak it romantically towards the subject, obviously. So I think it's an advantage if sometimes that information goes missing. It worked to my advantage, at least. So, thank you.
Any more questions? I would like to thank Amit and Tusharika for a fascinating session indeed. As Mr. Singha said, I would also like to place a word of thanks for the Royal Family of Jaipur and the management of Ashok Club for allowing us to have this literary sessions almost on a monthly basis. Many of you might not be aware that there is now a literary society in Ashok Club, and hopefully in times to come, Ashok Club literary sessions will become as well known as the Tollygunj Book Club and Tollygunj Book Session in Calcutta. Yeah. Okay. And as Tusharika said, Amit is available to sign books. They are available on discounted road. And please do have a cup of tea with us. Thank you very much.
मेरा नाम डॉक्टर अमित रंजन है और मैं असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर हूँ अंग्रेज़ी का NCERT।
इस किताब के लेखक हैं
जी। ये जॉन लैंग के विषय में किताब है। जॉन लैंग झांसी की रानी के वकील थे और हिंदुस्तान में ही रहते थे 1842 से 1864 के बीच। 1864 में उनकी मृत्यु हुई, मसूरी में उनका कब्र है। तो वकील थे झांसी की रानी के। इसके सिवाय उन्होंने बहुत सारी वकालत की हिंदुस्तान में और बहुत मशहूर लेखक भी थे और संपादक अपना अखबार चलाते थे जिसका नाम था मुफस्सिल। वो अपने वक्त के बहुत ही इंटेलेक्चुअल विद्वान किरदार हैं और इतिहास उनको भूल गया है, तो इसलिए ये किताब boxing?
कहाँ है? Do you think it is?
So yesterday night, I had a whole group chat with all these people. Vishwas,
Thank you. It was my pleasure, Mr.